giving a brief introduction to a broader perspective on communication and preparedness in the Nordic context is hard, especially in 5 minutes. But I'll do my best, and I think I'll start from a perspective that I myself am a bit more at home in, and that is sort of the governance aspects of things. And I would want to sort of propose or outline a thought pattern of governance, and sort of what is governance in the context of communication infrastructures in this context, because it ties back to that over and over again. Sort of where is the power in these systems, and who has that? And starting somewhere, I would just want to sort of put a word in our minds on the topic of sovereignty and digital sovereignty, because basically when we think about our communications infrastructures over time, going back to where Sophie and Signe alluded to, down to the 1950s, or even further back, we had a very much a physical design palette over which we enabled governance and institutions to govern communications. But in the early 1990s, with the coming of the internet, we suddenly got a new layer of digital infrastructure on top of things. And this new layer coincided in time with the end of the Cold War and the opening up of the world. Suddenly we were in a sort of mental modus operandi where we could travel anywhere, go anywhere, have a free market and an open infrastructure. And it was in that sort of sense of the world that our global communication infrastructures were actually built, layer by layer, from the very backbone layers that we have seen some graphs of, and then going up. And going up through these layers from the backbone to network layers and infrastructure layers to communication layers and application layers, we suddenly come up to a layer of our social engagement and where we are together. And that's sort of where the other part of this conversation takes place, and which has to do with another concept of the publics, and that is the digital public infrastructure, or the commons of our infrastructures. Because in the physical world, from the 19th century and going onwards, we've had in the Nordic region quite a lot of work going on around what is the commons, what is the public, what is the town square that we can meet and communicate, and what is the regulation around what enables us to speak and talk and make our voices heard. And over time, we have built a number of institutions around the physical world of communication in order to enable for us to be able to speak our mind and deliberate democratically together. But going into the digital space, we haven't really had that conversation when it comes to the commons of conversations in the infrastructure of our communicative approaches that are sort of more towards ourselves in the application layer. From 2010 and onwards, we have enabled a bunch of companies to take the space of the commons in the digital world. And we have taken that as a given. It's the default. It's from where we have started to regulate. We are thinking of Meta or X or TikTok or whatever their name is of these platforms as some kind of thing that is given, a natural that should just be there. But we know also that that's not true. It's a very fluid and shifting landscape. But still, from a sort of public perspective, we have taken a step back. We don't engage and go forward into that space, thinking about what is digital public infrastructure, what is the commons of conversations in a digital space. And we can see that there are all kinds of movements pulling towards that space now, and that's where I'll end, sort of. I think when it comes to regulation and thinking about communication in this more person-centered context of how we meet and greet and engage in society, in that space of our conversations, we just take it as a given that we are in Facebook or Instagram or wherever we are. But at the same time, we can see something happening. Just over the past 1.5 years, we've seen some really exciting movements where we have started to have conversation about common protocols and common standards for that layer of conversations. We have even seen Meta this summer introduce Threads as a platform where they have explicitly said that they want to build an open standard and open protocol-based infrastructure. In the Nordic Council of Ministers report from this summer, which a think tank from the Nordic Council of Ministers wrote, we also wrote about these kinds of protocols, and we can see how they have started to take effect in other domains, where WordPress, for example, which has 50% of all web pages, have enabled ActivityPub as an open protocol, as the default protocol for conversations on the platform of WordPress. So suddenly, over just some short space of time, we have seen some movements, but in a policy level and in a conversation level, we're still in the conversation of the default being the incumbent actors of these platform companies. So what I would want to sort of propose in going into this panel of preparedness and communication is to think about all these layers as being sort of some kind of, they are intertwined with each other, and asking us sort of what is the public engagement of this. And I think it's also where Sophie and Signe ended their conversation, is sort of what should the public be in this conversation? Where should regulation be? How should it be enacted? What should it be about? And who should have the power over the conversations of our Nordic region and our communications?
Carl talked about digital sovereignty, and I wonder, coming from a relatively smaller context, the context of Greenland, how do you think that translates into the Greenland context, or like how vulnerable is or how resilient is Greenland in the communication infrastructures?
In small entities, complex systems that are increasingly difficult to regulate, you can see the tendency. A lot of these things we're talking about is being regulated with EU legislation in the Nordics. Greenland or other entities that are not part of the EU have more topics to deal with, and it's much more complex when you're a small country, on one hand. On the other hand, Greenland is very big, and I was a little bit confused to look at this map. I don't know if you can see it. It's here, it looks smaller than Denmark, when in fact it is 50 times bigger. So I think Nordregio, maybe this is a little bit of misunderstanding. So of course, my point with this being that when we talk about the physical infrastructures, they are less resilient because submarine cables break. In Greenland, we tried that with a power breakdown and no internet at all. And literally, I was sitting in my dark flat, and I didn't know whether the country was being invaded. Luckily, it wasn't. There was a power cut and no backup. But it's more it's less resilient in large, topographically diverse countries, so to speak. So Greenland is both big and small. Yeah. I think would be my answer.
Because you also do a lot of work about the Arctic region in general. How does that translate, for example, to the general vulnerabilities of the Nordic in general, and what should we be prepared for?
I think the Arctic, me studying especially Greenland, is an interesting case for people not living in the Arctic to look at, because many things become more pronounced, which makes it interesting to study, because it's the same tendencies that we see in the 4 Nordic countries that Signe and Sophie talked about. But I think it's sometimes more easy to spot the trends in Greenland. For example, to give an example, you talked about Starlink and the fact that it might start to influence in all parts of the value chain. with providing access network. But already today in Greenland, Starlink is cheaper than the internet provided by the monopoly company because it's so expensive because of this infrastructure. So we can, I don't know what will happen with Starlink, but we can see tendencies that are not that apparent in the Nordic, in the smaller Nordic countries. We can see them, some of this, especially relating to the physical infrastructures, we can see it more clearly in the Arctic because there is less redundancy, as we call it, there is less backup. So we can see the effects of, say, breakdowns. We've tried it. So when I speak to students in Denmark, they don't know how their internet is actually being provided to their phones. But the students at the University of Greenland, they know because it's so physical, it breaks down, and it costs 1,000 kroner, which is a lot of money. So I think it's the Arctic case can be used in the smaller Nordic countries to learn what are the challenges. Yes, it's not translatable one-to-one, but I think there are some good lessons to be learned. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Julia, your research focuses a lot on data centers in the Nordics, which is an area where a lot of players have been establishing themselves, like Facebook and Google. What do you think that attracts these companies to come to these countries, and whether you think that these companies share any of the Scandinavian or Nordic values?
What attracts them is about 10 years ago, the governments of basically all the Nordic countries really welcomed through policies and through subsidies of all sort of kinds tech giants to establish data centers and their storage facilities. And the result is that now 10 years later, we see that these companies have established some of the largest data centers in Europe, in the Nordics. So we have in Finland, Google in Hamina. We have in Sweden, Amazon has this mega complex in spanning across 3 towns in Katrineholm, Västerås, and Eskilstuna. We have Facebook also. We have all the companies here. And we've been doing research also with colleagues in Finland and now in Linköping on a lot of questions that have emerged with these developments. And I think I wanted to pick up in the morning some things that was said about in the beginning in your talk about the eroding boundaries, not just between different systems that the internet has replaced. And I think that what we see here today is that these boundaries, the data centers, have really split and eroded boundaries to other sectors in society. And here we've been looking particularly in questions of energy. And so these companies have established themselves here because it's been cheap. So the Nordics are the cheap backyard of the Silicon Valley, where if production cheap labor is in China, here we have cheap infrastructure. So we have cheap land, cheap electricity for them, cheap water. And they don't need so much workers anyway. But in terms of electricity, I think that's something that I think it's interesting to follow and look in terms of new issues that are emerging and we're completely unprepared to handle. Because what we see is that, for instance, companies like Amazon and Microsoft in Sweden have booked so much grid capacity in grids. Like in Amazon in Katrineholm has booked 1/4 of the grid in the town. And they're the top energy consumer in the town. The second top is a chicken slaughtery, Kronfågel, which slaughters 200,000 chickens every day, according to some reports. And they are by far behind after Amazon. So Amazon is the biggest customer of electricity. And this has created basically informal monopolies over electricity use. So these companies reserve a lot of power in the grid that they don't use. And they prevent, in practice, the establishment of other industries. So we have had case, for instance, at the bread company Pågen. Maybe some of you are eating their breads. They have not been able to establish a bakery in Skåne because Amazon took a lot of the capacity for their data center before that, and they had to establish in a different place. And we see the same dynamics also in Stockholm right now, where other data centers and other local industries have not been able to establish. And this is an ongoing issue, which actually, so it leads to the question that the scale of the electricity use and overbookings has destabilized the grid, the electricity grid in our countries, to the extent that we fear power cuts. And for this same reason, these big companies are also engaging currently in projects to build new power lines and enormous diesel backup generators, which are the size of a nuclear power plant. So, here in Sörmland, the Amazon is building a 600 megawatt generator, which is the size of nuclear power plant, because of the instabilities that they've contributed to. So the question is, are we ready to lose local companies, businesses, other non-digital industries in favor of providing storage space, cheap storage space, to the big tech? And it's basically a question also if we're gonna lose not only public values of the welfare state, but also access to much of the basic infrastructure which we take for granted today, like electricity, and also local economies, and maybe the trust in our own institutions. And maybe we need to also enter in conflicts with our own citizens over who should be given a priority, a data center company, or if there's a limit in the grid, a data center company or a local business.
Yeah.
So we are completely unprepared, both in terms of legislation and policies, and the societal implications of these developments. And they're just starting to surface here.
Right. So you mentioned that we are unprepared, especially in terms of regulation. What kind of regulation over this sector would you propose?
Yeah, I don't have a solution to that. Unfortunately, I wish I had. But I think one thing to think about is partly we don't know what kind of thing is this, these data centers. Are they buildings? Are they archives? Are they energy providers? What are they? But what we know is that they basically, it's a question of how much the media economy that they're supporting and enabling is allowed to impact local places, local grids. I think since they're neither a fish nor a horse nor, I don't know, it's probably a good start is to think that there is no really regulation right now about computing work, because they're basically facilities that they do storage and computing, the AI, the platforms, all these things. So perhaps media policy needs to come into conversation with urban planning and energy regulation in some kind of constellation. Like, all these need to come out of their comfort zones in order to decide how much, like set some limits, how much resources should be allocated or make sense to be allocated to such companies. If there is, we are living currently in a scarcity of electricity in Sweden, where we have not been in this situation. And we might get into other kind of scarcities as well. So basically, we need some kind of policies that set limits, someone to this in scale, in size, in public resource consumption. We need to assess where is it possible and desirable to create these infrastructures, and where is it not, and where is it just creating much more problems. And do we really want to solve Silicon Valley's problems of locating data? Why do we need to do it here? And at what cost? So that could be one direction. And another thing, which is completely stunning, and I think that this is just the first must step and speaks to what was said in the morning, is also to create some kind of code of conduct that obliges them to be public. Because even when we've tried in our research team to trace data about, okay, how many megawatts, how many, like numbers, just facts, this is incredibly difficult to get. And it's completely unprecedented, the degree of secrecy that these companies are allowed to have in a culture which we historically in the Nordics have had, we assume to be open, especially about use of resources. So I think that this connects very much to the governance of commons, but commons that are not, they're like, I think we need to expand also what are the commons, because the commons, we are now talking about electricity as well, and about water, and about land, about everything. And it's just unimaginable, the transformation that we've seen in the last years, that how much has the media economy changed the form and shape
Yes, well, as we heard this morning quite well from Signe and Sophia, the data is integral part of the new kind of digital infrastructure that we have landed quite quickly. And of course, that creates kind of new vulnerabilities and dependencies. So data is not just the market, it's of course also a material for AI and development. So different kinds of development services and all that. Data is needed for that, and therefore it is in itself also, we can think of it as an infrastructure. And now, of course, on national level, many countries are also thinking about their data infrastructure in certain ways. However, the kind of big tech dependency is creating a situation where they are mainly managing the data and using the data for different purposes. And in our research, we've looked at how welfare state services are how they use different kinds of data-driven technologies and how people experience datafication in their everyday life. And what we see is that often in these welfare state services, it's very difficult to kind of combine the technology perspective with the kind of public values, or it's a lot of work. And often it is so that the ideas of public value, equality, and universalism is not really the same, like data-driven logics works different way. It's not about universality and equality because it's very much about categorization, personalization, and using data for profit. So these are a lot of those problems that many of these welfare services face. But then also, if we look at how people feel about data-driven services, they identify the kind of idea of surveillance and biases and the sort of difficulty in finding fit in the systems, also use of data without their consent, and the overall hidden structure of datafication that people are very much aware of. They know that this is happening, but they don't exactly know how. And this causes quite a lot of uncertainties and also shame, which I think can be identified in many sectors of the society because we don't know how these important things work. So I think that's one of those. But then the mistrust is also connected to what we've seen lately, quite a lot, data leakages. So there aren't systems that are completely soundproof. So there are leakages happening all the time in different ways. And then we have different kinds of cyber attacks, especially now when we are talking about the kind of difficult political and crisis situation in Europe. So there are a lot of these threats that people identify, and they feel that it makes the whole digital infrastructure in a way suspicious. It's hard to trust these new kind of systems. And if we think about Nordic welfare states, they've been traditionally well trusted. And here, when the welfare services and our communication structures become datafied and embedded with the big tech power, it changes that situation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a particularly salient point, and Sophie and Signe mentioned that they follow the data, and sometimes I feel that the following the data and following the money is starting to become a similar thing, because there's all these dependencies between the markets and the infrastructures. So how do you think that, what is the power of these big companies, and what are the risks that you can see?
Well, we saw in the presentation quite well how the big tech is very well equipped to maintain and manage all the infrastructure, and they indeed have a lot of infrastructural power if we think about the communication or any sector of life, because they offer those services, infrastructural services. If we think about, for example, Amazon, they have 30% of the world's cloud computing markets. And the second one is Microsoft. And so if we think about all these services, emails and communication services within kind of intranets we have in different companies and in public service institutions, we are all dependent on these services. And this, of course, is their huge power. And the risks are, of course, there. What happens if they dominate too much? And in terms of, for example, the data, they own the data we have, and the fact that they have their own data centers. Actually, one of the reasons why they probably need to have those also in Europe is because they have to maintain the data in Europe. And that's one of the regulations that I think seems to be working, but what does it mean really is another question. But then I think the biggest risk perhaps in this huge dominance and dependency is that we cease to think about alternatives. We are satisfied with the way things are, or it seems too difficult. We are already too deep in there, so we don't think about alternatives. EU, I think, has been quite good in trying to do something. They've tried to think a little bit differently, but I think that's it's really difficult job that they have. But we really have to be able to think about alternatives. There is the Gaia X initiative, for example, which to me seems very complicated, and I don't really understand at all how it works. But it's a European kind of parallel to cloud service. So that's something that's been under development. But yeah, I think that these are the risks that I see.
Yeah. And to you, Carl, how does this align with what you were talking about, perspectives in digital resilience, preparedness in the region, data sovereignty? Are these risks something that you guys see in your own research?
When I listen to all of you three, there's all these words that come up that I think tie into the question of governance in different ways. So we have the issue in the Greenlandish context of sort of where should resilience be? Should it be the state that provides resilience, or should it be the citizen who caters to resilience? And in some parts of the larger Greenland in the north, I've come to understand that the sort of equation of sort of who is supposed to have resilience is very different, because there's so much out in the edge with so much breakages, etc., that becomes an issue. And I think that's an interesting thing to think, sort of, what is the welfare state? What should it support, and to what degree, and where, and all those things. I think that ties in well. Then it comes to questions of secrecy. In your conversation, sort of how do we know what all this is about? And you, Karina, you mentioned shame as a factor when it comes to policy, and sort of how am I supposed to know about this or not, and so etc. And I'm thinking about the term governing and governance. So what does it imply? What do we need to have as governors to be able to govern? And in the Nordic welfare context, I mean, there are some words around that. That is, we need a shared knowledge environment to be able to do that. We need trust in order to be able to govern. We need openness so that we can have the knowledge provided to us. And we need an idea about the commons. But in all of your examples, we see the opposite. We see shame, we see mistrust, we see secrecy, we see a lack of resilience. And so in some sense, we can see that the power shift that we have seen over these 10, 15 or 20 years, they have in one sense come to erode parts of what we perceive as to be values within the Nordic welfare context, and we haven't addressed that. And I think in order to do that, what I have seen, especially during my time as a special counsel for the Swedish government, is the thing about shame. We lack knowledge in our political institutions around these discussions, and we lack arenas to come together for those conversations between different kinds of policy environments. So I think, I mean, these kinds of settings are extremely valuable to enable those kinds of shared spaces of knowledge and trust.
Yeah, I think that this sensation that we have of inevitability and trying to find these alternatives, I think that it's a particularly important thing in which not only us as researchers, but also policymakers in the industry need to coalesce.
And I mean, there we come into sort of the practices of governance. Sort of how do we go about to come up with new policy? What are our methods? What are the practices we use as policymakers to come up with new policies? If we want to have proper alternatives, we need to come up with them. And I mean, in research, there's a bunch of different methodologies to actually do that. And we are good in research to actually design methodologies for exploration. But I would want to see that happening more within the regulatory environments in and of themselves. I mean, with such things as, I mean, we see examples like policy sandbox practices in AI regulation, etc. But I think we could see much more of that.